How often do you work on non-financial data? This is the IssuesWatch podcast. Hello, and welcome to the IssuesWatch podcast. I'm Matt Charney, your host for this week's accounting and auditing episode. I'm an audit director at Clifton Larson Allen. And joining me today is Marissa Flood, Assurance Senior at CLA. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
This episode qualifies for Nano CPE credit. If you're interested in earning CPE credit for this episode, hit the pause button now and head over to njcpa.org/nano to find out how. Quick disclaimer, the views and statements expressed herein are our own and not necessarily those of the NJCPA or CLA. Okay, so we're going to jump right into it. And today we have another exposure draft from the AICPA.
Exciting.
Yeah, they always are. And the topic of this today is going to be ethics revisions. And this one actually comes from the Professional Ethics Executive Committee, or the PEEC or PEEC. I haven't heard of this committee before, but it sounds like they know what they're doing because there's a lot of stuff in here. The most important is clarifying independence requirements for non-attest engagements. So for just a quick refresher, that's examinations, reviews, agreed upon procedures, preparations, compilations, things like that. And the focus of it is pretty interesting because it's not necessarily financial statement data and doing those procedures over financial information, but more focused on non-financial information. And if viewers recall, last time we talked about ESG and all those new rules that were coming out and how a lot of states are rolling out those rules and things that they want to be required and things like that. These rules are really kind of focused on making sure that attest guidance over the AICPA, again, not FASB, I'm not talking about ASCs here, we're talking about AICPA and attest rules, those are going to be made broader and more applicable to those kinds of engagements.
Okay, so that makes sense. So as those are becoming more and more popular, like We're seeing them be required a little bit more, we're seeing them just be wanted by clients a bit more.
Right.
I think that this is actually going to be really great in kind of clarifying these requirements here. Yeah,
exactly. So the things that we're kind of talking about here, again, not financial statement work, but more like if you were hired to do a greenhouse gas emissions study, not necessarily something an accountant would do. That's something I also want to point out. I feel like these new rules can be geared towards other professionals so that they can use these standards to do that kind of work. The thing that I think will affect accountants the most is stuff under internal control studies and things like that is going to fall under this bucket here.
Mm-hmm.
So not sure how much experience viewers have with things like this, but I know we have a few colleagues that have done internal control studies, and what they normally do is they'll show up to a client site or a certain factory, certain location, something like that, and management will usually want to know, what exactly are my people here doing to keep our processes kind of working, and what can we do to make it better? Usually they want to do that in order to get narratives going. Maybe they have to do their walkthroughs for their financial statement audit that's coming up, and they're doing something in the summer just to get that stuff rolling. That would fall usually under agreed upon procedures, which I find pretty interesting that this is listed under here. I'll get to that in a second, because agreed upon procedures usually are agreed upon, so I don't have a lot of guidance around them. They're usually defined between the accountant and the client. But doubling back to controls, that kind of work, it doesn't have a lot of guidance surrounding it. And sure, you can do reviews and you can do compilations and things like that, but you wouldn't normally touch the internal control piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested to see what kind of comments that accountants give or the AICPA gives to the accountants to say, hey, when you go out and you do an engagement like this, make sure you're doing this to stay independent, make sure you're doing that to make sure you get the proper assurance. I'll put that in quotes because for a test you may not necessarily be getting assurance depending on the level of service that you're doing and things like that.
And I'm curious where this is going to go, because this is phase one of what, a 5-step process for the article. So so we have a lot more coming. But I'm curious to see kind of how they tailor that, because I was reading this right here, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that jumped out at me was they're changing, the new term is being introduced, period covered by the attest report. So kind of what you were saying with the agreed upon procedures and everything like that, the period covered by the financial statements is what it will replace.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think right there, that's a start to me, that they're starting to kind of tailor those procedures more around,
right.
These different areas and not fully just worry about the financial statements. I think we kind of get into a little bit of like a murky waters when we're having a report that says period covered by the financial statements, and it's not financial data.
Right.
And because they're becoming more popular, I think that this is great that they're coming out with this.
Yeah, I find that small change to be far more impactful than it might first appear. Because at the end of the day, what I think is going to happen if this exposure draft is approved is those standard AICPA reports for reviews, comps, preps, all those things we just talked about, those are going to change just to slightly say, instead of financial statements, it'll say attest report. Seems like a small change. But at the end of the day, now, because it's an attest report, not a financial statement, if you're working on something and there's non-financial data included in that, all of a sudden, your responsibility for it has increased. At least that's how I see this, is that they want to make sure that we're paying attention to gas emissions, to cybersecurity controls, internal controls, social governance issues that might be important to the entity or their investors or their financial statement, their attest report users. See, that's going to take some getting used to. And that stuff is something that we're not typically trained in how to get assurance on. And again, assurance in quotes, because not necessarily getting reasonable assurance in any of these procedures. They're not audits. But I think that's going to be a bigger shift than people are expecting.
I do too.
At least that's my guess.
No, I feel like, we see these exposure drafts sometimes and we're like, oh, yay, a new exposure draft. But I do think that this one is important because it's not only it's not only a one-step process, it's a 5-step process. Right. So you miss one step in this, you're kind of, in my opinion, going to feel behind because it's working to kind of piece certain paragraphs of the code of conduct and together and edit them and evaluate them deeper to make sure everything's working effectively for the financial and non-financial engagements. So
right.
I think that this is going to have, a bit more of an impact than just the little article you see and they ask you to make comments on, because this
absolutely
this is really going to have you
those reports that you attach to your statements, those are standard for a reason, right? All of the words in those reports are handpicked to give a kind of sense of, again, assurance in quotes, but assurance to what exactly is in the report that now follows. And if it's not highlighting financial statement information anymore, it's highlighting non-financial information, I'm very curious to see what exactly firms are going to do to make sure that they're covering all that information, and more so how the AICPA will respond to gear the standards towards that.
Yeah.
That being said, we mentioned that this is step 1 out of 5 steps that the AICPA has announced to kind of change their guidance for the future to kind of address these new problems. I wouldn't call it problems, new things that are becoming of importance to users and investors. And the next phase after this will be aligning to international standards, especially the IAESBA's, it's a mouthful, sustainability assurance rules. I don't think I can. This one doesn't surprise me too much. I feel like international standards and U.S. standards are aligning all the time. So that's kind of typical. In the AESBA comes out with new rules. The AICPA typically isn't far behind. So that one doesn't surprise me there. Here's one that does surprise me a little bit more, which is the second step, which is substantive changes to address inconsistencies in practice and address more complex independence issues. Now, we don't have any information on this right now, but I'm very curious to see what they're going to issue to kind of address differences in common practice, because that is usually up to the accountant and their interpretation, and it feels like they're going to issue more rules to say, no, if you have this situation, it's going to be this answer from now on. Yeah,
or at least, here are your few and far in between options, and don't really stray from those.
Right, exactly, yeah. Next after that will be applying guidance for agreed upon procedures and compilation engagements. Again, I find that pretty interesting because the agreed upon procedures typically are discussed between the accountant and the client, and then we agree that that's all we're going to do. We're not going to do much more than that. And it sounds like there might be some overarching rules governing those procedures now. which is interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, again, we don't have the information coming out yet on this. I am excited to hear about it, but it does say like they're going to start using broader terms like subject matter and things like that. So maybe it's kind of just tailoring and cleaning up that guidance for them.
Right.
To make sure we're...
Yeah, hopefully it's not too constrictive, because I can think of a few agreed upon procedures that are very specific for a reason.
Yeah, I have one that's incredibly specific. I've never done anything like it, and I can't imagine what that would do if they started to really hone in on specific procedures to perform.
Exactly. And the last step will be updates to non-authoritative guidance, which seems like a broad term. I'm sure that's going to be kind of a catch-all at the end of this whole process to see what the AICPA thinks they may have missed. And they'll just say, okay, if you feel like you can do it this way or that way, that maybe they'll respond to some of the comments, which, by the way, if you're interested in reading this exposure draft and you want to give some feedback, comments are due by September 5th, 2025. So we pretty much have the summer to give the AICPA some feedback on how we feel about these changes. And like I said, I think that last step is going to be a catch-all.
Yeah, and keep an eye out for these next steps. Give your comments on any part of these, anything that finds your interest, and that's it.
Yeah, I think the space to watch is going to be actually how banks respond to some of these changes.
I agree.
Because, at least in the space that we see, typically, and this is more of a personal anecdote, most of the reports that I issue are for the benefit of banks. Those are the financial statement users. So when it comes down to it, are the banks going to be very interested in these ESG things, environmental emissions, social governance, things like that, whether their controls are up to snuff, in order to say, hey, there's new rules about this, we want to see that stuff enforced.
Okay.
Great. Okay. In closing, though, here are some upcoming accounting and auditing events. The annual Governmental Accounting and Auditing Conference is on July 22nd. And for those just getting started, there's an Audit Staff Essentials course on July 29th and 30th. Get details on these events and more at njcpa.org/events. And be sure to join the Society's Accounting and Auditing Standards Interest Group. Sign up for free at njcpa.org/groups. Thank you for watching or listening.